which is the lands of the Monaro Ngarigo people. And I pay respect to the traditional custodians of this land and their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So I was actually thinking about the current situation in Ukraine about the time that Charlie asked me to do the thought of the day. And immediately I thought of the words of Paul Harris, who was the founder of Rotary. And he said, "The road to war is well paved. The road to peace is a wilderness." Now, since Rotary was founded in 1905, Rotary's commitment to world understanding and peace has been a cornerstone of its activities. And my true thought for the day are actually the words of the 2012 Rotary International President, Tanaka, because he said, "Peace in all of the ways that we can understand it is a real and realistic goal for Rotary. Peace is not something that can only be achieved through agreements by governments or through heroic struggles. It is something that we can find and that we can achieve every day and in many simple ways." Now, as Charlie's just told you, one of the key areas of Rotary's work is peace and conflict prevention resolution. And Rotary clubs have a unique opportunity to influence attitudes to work in this area, whether it's at home or around the world. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about the world from Tom this evening. And indeed, without peace, it wouldn't be possible to achieve the levels of trust, cooperation, and inclusiveness that it's necessary to solve the challenges currently facing the world, whether it's the results of climate change, reduction in the world's fresh water, or the lack of affordable food. Here in Australia, of course, we are blessed that we don't have war and civil disorder with shooting in our streets and bombs being dropped on us every day. But there are too many people in our society and community who still cannot go about their daily lives in peace. They face prejudice, disharmony, strife, abuse, violence, bullying in their homes, on social media, in their workplaces, on the streets, or even in the shopping centres. Now, back in 2014, as Charlie said, and I can't believe it was that long ago, a group of us got together. I noticed Karen's here on the call tonight, and we formed the peace building group within our club. And our aim was to take a leadership role in promoting peace building and conflict resolution locally, nationally, and globally. One of the things that we have done was to introduce the Rotary Club of Sydney Community Peace Prize. And that aim of that award was to give a group working in our own community that are creating a culture of peace, by whether it's combating racism, violence, discrimination, bullying, corruption, or any other issue that creates disharmony. And worthy winners, I remind you of this award, have been the Shared Table Project, Together for Humanity, Tribal Warrior, the Bread and Butter Project, Canna Farms, Play for Lives, and Turbans for Australia. A very diverse group as it happens, and they all work at building peace in our local community. Peace does start with us, all of us, and we can do our bit every single day. So I'm going to end with the words of my thought of the day. Peace is not something that can only be achieved through agreements by governments or through heroic struggles. It is something that we can find and that we can achieve every day and in many simple ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and sage words indeed. And as a career peace builder, or vocational peace builder is probably a better word, I certainly have to agree with that. Folk standing around a table signing an agreement certainly doesn't create peace. It might create a policy platform, but where the work happens is in community, which is what Rotary does best, is working in community. We should never lose sight that Rotary has a significant influence within the communities and within our communities, and which is where peace happens. So, thank you, Chris, and I acknowledge Chris's work as the founder of the peace group within Rotary Club of Sydney, and certainly peace groups and peace committees across Rotary have flourished in probably since that period in 2014. Where Sydney Club was one of the clubs that was paving the way. So it's now my opportunity to introduce Tom. And I hope I don't steal any of your intended words here, Tom, but Tom was a Rotary Peace Fellow back in 2010. And as a Rotary Peace Fellow, Tom had the opportunity to do a number of field visits. Tom was studying at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, but had the opportunity to do a number of field visits in northern Thailand, where he looked at the issue of human trafficking, and also field visits into Cambodia, looking at post-conflict reconstruction after the Pol Pot regime. Tom, I think, was fortunate to have a roommate, and his roommate was actually me. And I think he was fortunate to have a roommate, because I can distinctly remember bringing Tom coffee early in the morning to get Tom out of bed and going for the next day of activity. Tom's a great storyteller, and one story, I hope I got this right, Tom, is how he fell into the field of peace building. And if I got this right, Tom, you're traveling and working in Pakistan, and I think you might have been teaching English when there was a significant earthquake, and Tom found himself being drawn into the emergency response in Pakistan as a result of that earthquake, and that really started a career or a lifetime of working in emergency response, humanitarian aid in disaster zones. So Tom has found himself, particularly in the Pacific, whenever there was a tsunami, earthquake, significant event in the Pacific, Tom was there and part of the response in his role with Red Cross. So the other aspect of Tom is he's a magnificent storyteller. He writes beautifully and has been able to retell some of his experiences in his published books through Hardy Grant. So I hope Tom whets, I know Tom will whet your appetite tonight, but if you want to learn more about Tom and read more of his stories, both his books, both Deep Field and Rising Tide, are cracking good reads. As I said, he's a beautiful storyteller. So Tom comes to us tonight from Turkey. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. And he's well, I'll let him tell you what he's doing there in Turkey, but still he finds himself responding to a significant humanitarian crisis, which is why he sits there in Turkey. Tom, great to have you. And I urge people, if you have questions that come to you, thank you. If questions come to you while Tom's chatting, please drop them into the chat, or certainly have the opportunity to ask Tom questions live. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be with you today. With this community of peace activists. So it's a fantastic opportunity. The course that Charlie and I did in Chula in Thailand, which is a surprisingly long time ago now, though the memories are very fresh, was just a terrific course. It was hosted by Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. It was 3 months long. It was a professional development program for people already working in the area, but to take time out to study peace building in all its different facets, and to go on these wonderful field trips. And I was never much of a morning person, and Charlie is a very effective alarm clock, I can assure you. But one of the extraordinary things about it, in addition to the field trips and the courses and the leading lecturers from around the world who came to the course, was just the opportunity to meet with the other Peace Fellows. And in particular, for me, Charlie was a fantastic person over that time, and in the 12 years subsequently to continue these conversations. One of the extraordinary things is that I would have been working in Sudan for a while, and was very involved in peace building in Sudan and Sudan's Darfur states. And Charlie had been working with the Sudanese community in Melbourne, and so we had very different vantage points and perspectives on the conflict and the ramifications of the conflict that we were able to discuss with. And that was, I think, part of the foundation, in addition to early starts of our friendship through the peace program. So it's a fantastic program that Rotary supports, and it's really helped with my career and in my daily work as well. And so my daily work, and I'll try and share my screen in a second and just talk a little bit about the context I find myself in. But I'm currently working with UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees. I'm based in Gaziantep, which is in southeast Turkey, and I'm working on the Syria crisis. And my capacity here is coordinating the shelter and settlements sector, and I'm working across the border in an area, an enclave of northwest Syria. So I'm based in Turkey, but the programs, the operations, and the coordination takes place in northwest Syria. So I'll just show you. I'll see if I can share my screen, and I'll run through some of the work that we're doing, some of the challenges and complexities that we face in this context. So I'll talk a little bit about the context and some of the work we do and some of the challenges that we face. You have an image here of a town. This is in Aleppo after the bombardments last year, and so these are some of the living conditions that people are in. And as part of the shelter and settlement sector, what we try to do is to provide emergency humanitarian response to people living in these kinds of conditions, and also some other conditions that I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is where we are within the context of the response. And just so you know, that the pre-war population of Syria was about 21 million. That's now substantially reduced. About half of those people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Many of them are displaced, and there are about 5 million Syrian refugees, about 3 million in Turkey. There are 1 million in Lebanon. There are about 750,000 in Jordan. There are almost 1 million people in Germany. So it's a significant achievement of the regime to produce that many refugees and IDPs and people in need of humanitarian assistance within their own country. So I'm working in this area here just surrounded by that red dot, and I live in Gaziantep, which is a bit further north. And so that's the area of operations. In 2010, when the Syrian revolution started, there was great hope. It was part of the Arab Spring that this would see a change in Syrian politics. And the revolution was very nearly successful. It got to the outskirts of Damascus, but then was driven back, particularly with Russian and Iranian support. And so now what's left of the opposition-held areas are in this sort of red area here that I've circled in the districts of Aleppo and also Idlib. There's an area, so that's the northwest where I'm focusing. There's an area in the northeast as well, which is yellow there that you can see, which is a predominantly Kurdish area, which is also sort of outside of regime control. But that red area is where I'm currently working. There are about 4 million people who are living in that area, and it's within Syria. So they are IDPs and not refugees. They're internally displaced. They're within their own country, but they're within this particular enclave. So that's the area of operation. I think the thing to note as well about this context is that the living conditions in Syria were prior to the conflict were probably not that dissimilar from living conditions in Australia. This was a middle-income country. It was an industrialized country. It had an operating, very effective education system. Syrians are known for their education and linguistic abilities. It had a major agricultural base. It had major urban centers in Damascus and Aleppo that for centuries had been very sophisticated, developed, wealthy places. And so this is what we now have as a consequence of 12 years of conflict. Many of the people in northwest Syria were driven out of those sorts of living conditions that were not perhaps too dissimilar from what we know in Australia, and are now living in conditions like this. So this is an image of one of the camps. It was actually the Atme camp, which is the first settled camp in northwest Syria, and so there are about 4 million people, 4.4 actually million people, according to latest assessments, who are living in conditions like this. There are about 2.2 million people who are in need of emergency shelter assistance. There are about 1,400 of these enormous unplanned, self-settled, informal sites. So there's no utilities in this site other than what people can do for themselves. No electricity, no water, sewage, drainage, sanitation, limited access to health and education and so on. So it's just, these sites have just developed from where people put their tents from when they were displaced over the course of the last 10 to 12 years. In those sites, we have about 1.7 million people. And of those 1.7 million people, nearly 750,000 are still living in tents. So it's a really intense humanitarian context. So there's a humanitarian response that we need to give to those people, but also it's not just a question of delivering aid. There are many other issues that we face, contextual issues. So there are changing front lines, for example, and in 2020, nearly 1 million people were displaced as military action proceeded to retake the urban area of Aleppo city. And you might have seen some of the extraordinary footage of the destruction of major urban centers in Syria. But that created a wave of people moving into northwest Syria for their own safety. The other thing is that while it's within Syria, of course, the regime itself, there's no central government, so there are lots of local authorities. And this map, the different colors you see here, an attempt to try to locate or map some of the different local authorities. So there's an area of Turkish influence. There's an area an area that's influenced by what we call, well, the local authorities euphemistically, or non-humanitarian armed groups, less euphemistically. Some of these groups have affiliations with organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So there's a patchwork of local authorities, of command structures. Some of them are very open and liberal and progressive. Others have links with some challenging groups, I suppose you might say. So there's this very complex political setup within northwest Syria. The other element that's very complex is that this is, for humanitarian response, this is a cross-border operation. So actually the humanitarians are based in Turkey and the response is based in Turkey. All the NGOs and the funders and the UN system is based in Turkey, and it has to cross an international border. And this is problematic in terms of international law, because states are sovereign. You're not supposed to be able to cross an international border at will, especially not against the wishes of the government. And so in order to do that, agencies and funders and donors in the UN system, although less NGOs, they're not as reliant, but the UN system is reliant on a UN Security Council resolution that enables the breaching of state sovereignty for the purposes of humanitarian assistance. And that comes up every year to 6 months. And so that's a major consideration, major hurdle, of course, because one of the belligerents in the conflict, Russia, sits on the UN Security Council, is responsible for passing this resolution. So every year, humanitarian assistance in northwest Syria hangs in the balance. And the other element of this is that the people are IDPs and not refugees. So they are within their own country. They haven't crossed an international border, and there's a whole regime of laws and institutions. I work for one of them in UNHCR that is there to support the needs and the rights of refugees. IDPs are a different category because of that. They're actually within their own country. And so there isn't the level of assistance and legal provision for those people as well. So these are some of the surrounding challenges that humanitarians face when working in these contexts. There are other challenges too, I'll talk about some of the solutions to these challenges or some of the options, but these are just to outline some of the contextual situation. So in addition to those political and legal challenges, there's the challenge of of natural disasters within a conflict zone. So each year during winter, we often get heavy rains and flooding. That's especially the case because many of the sites are settled on agricultural land. It's not really meant for human settlement. And so it gets incredibly muddy and it floods, and people have to live in these very challenging conditions. Many of the people live in tents, and 750,000 people live in tents. The tents are often very old. They're often filled with mattresses and polyester blankets and all sorts of things trying to keep people warm. In winter, it can get incredibly cold, and heating obviously is done by coal-fired stoves primarily within the tent. And so every day there are reports of tents burning down and people being burnt and sometimes dying as a consequence of fires in camps. So this is a major issue that we face in this context with the inadequacy of shelter provision. So the other context, as we've talked about a bit already, is just the IDP sites. Unorganized, self-settled, agricultural land, not linked to utilities, and just 1,400 of them. So it's a massive amount of land and sites to be addressed one way or another through the shelter system. Then we have winter. And so in addition to flooding, we had, and this is the case recently, we had the worst snowstorms in 35 years. Temperatures got down to -13 degrees. So if you can imagine being in that, in an old tent, it's extremely difficult. And many of the tents collapsed. In fact, overnight, we had about 10,000 tents collapsing because of the weight of snow on fairly fragile frames. The other thing to remember about these sites, and these figures actually, today we've got a new report on the figures. They're slightly changed, but actually the overwhelming majority of people in the sites are children. So 58% now, we estimate, of people living in these inadequate shelters and these terrible sites are actually children. The figures for the number of women have gone down, so it's about 20% women. And yet, and there's an interesting gender lens, if you like, on this response. The majority of response is based around the idea of a single able-bodied man able to take a tent and go off into a field. It doesn't think about the wider location and the wider needs of communities, of the people who actually live in the sites. The need for stronger shelter, the need for links to facilities, amenities, education, health, livelihoods, all this sort of stuff. We live in a very antiquated world of humanitarian response, and it doesn't really consider the community needs of people who live in those sites. So that's a major element of our current advocacy, is to try to change the response to better reflect the needs of the people who actually have to live through it. And the final challenge, and this is perhaps the major challenge, is that we're still living in an active conflict zone. And this is an image taken from last year, at about the time the UN Security Council resolution was up for renewal, and different sides decided to, as they say in diplomatic language, signal their voting intent. So this is a Russian bombardment of an aid depot in northwest Syria. There are also a number of attacks on schools and hospitals as well at the same time. And the intent of this is destabilization. They also bomb markets, by the way. So it's making life difficult. It's destabilization. It's suggesting that the Security Council resolution, which provides the basis for humanitarian response and the funding for it, may not be renewed. So these are some of the complex challenges that humanitarian responders face in this context. So just and I suppose before we get on to some of the solutions, so it also reveals some of the limitations of humanitarian response. And as you can see, I think from this picture, it's an overwhelming problem with relatively few tools and resources to address it, and yet a lot of, particularly among the Syrian NGOs, and I work predominantly with Syrian NGOs, an awful lot of hard work and very goodwill that goes into this response. But still, it's inadequate and it's challenging. And the challenges are many. They're from funders. There's a bit element of donor fatigue and funding. It's 10 years into the conflict, people aren't going anywhere. There's the idea, as we've talked about, that humanitarian response is to keep life-saving keep people alive. It's life-saving. And yet after 10 years, what does life-saving response look like? It's not just a tent or a tarpaulin or a blanket or some money. We have to think about what life-saving response looks like in a context of protracted displacement. The average period of displacement now in conflicts is about 25 years. So we need to rethink what humanitarian response means in this context. And that's a process that's only now underway in northwest Syria. We have the political complexities that we've talked about, the non-humanitarian armed groups, the interests of third-party territorial claims, such as a claim of Turkey into the territorial claim of Turkey in northwest Syria. We've got the interests of Damascus and the ability that they have to call on particularly Russian aerial power to attack what they perceive as their enemies in northwest Syria. We've got the relation we've got, I think, the perceptions of humanitarian aid by the regime, and that's a major concern for some of the humanitarian actors who are dependent for reasons of state sovereignty on authorization by Damascus to be able to continue their operations. So if the regime continues to perceive humanitarian assistance as being longer term, permanent, unjust, and not equal to what's being provided in regime controlled areas, then there'll be additional problems for agencies that have operations also in regime controlled areas. So there are a number of kind of political complexities in the response as well. And so humanitarian actors have to navigate this, and it's very evident in the shelter sector, and it's very evident in the language that we use. So as an example of some of the challenges that we face when we talk about shelter, when we talk about settlements, and we talk about how to address the problems in these IDP sites, there are a number of kind of terms that we can't use because it will offend one or other of the different parties for different reasons. So we can't talk about permanency. We can't talk about durable solutions. We can't talk about anything that's in a longer term, that has a longer term horizon. We can't talk about the word community because there's a sense that is in some way a longer term settlement. We can't use building materials like concrete. That is seen as being too long term as well. We can't, in the shelter and settlements sector, use the word house. That's also off the card. So it's a very constrained world, and so the options we have are framed in a way by the language that we can use, and that means that the humanitarian system is constantly trying to navigate and find solutions that will be politically acceptable, not just good solutions to address humanitarian problems, but solutions that will be acceptable to a number of different conflicting sides, and that's incredibly difficult and is one of the challenges of the system. So I'll just go on briefly to some of the options that we have. So obviously tents, a lot of tents have gone out. Partly that's necessary because of the large-scale sudden displacement, 1 million people in 2020, but also because of these limitations on what we can and can't do. So the tent is the default humanitarian option for northwest Syria. It has huge limitations, especially in the cold. It catches fire. It doesn't help in the long run. Can I go on? Somehow stopped. So I'm not sure what's happened there. Somehow. Is there am I still the host?
Yeah, nothing's changed, Tom.
Oh, there. Okay, great. Sorry, there's a technical glitch. So the tents is one issue. So another issue is unfinished buildings. We've seen a couple of images of that, and there's still lots of people who are living in these unfinished buildings. So trying to refurbish, rehabilitate these buildings is a key humanitarian option. Another one is winterization support. So each year, about half of our shelter budget, so about $50 million, goes on just providing fuel and stoves and blankets and mattresses for people to get through these very intense winters. And what we've been trying to introduce over the last year or so is a much more longer term approach. So the idea of some site planning, some basic infrastructure improvements. So here you can see some drainage ditches and some roads to reorganize the sites a bit and make them less prone to flooding and more dignified places to live. And more recently, we've been trying to talk about what comes beyond the tent. We can't talk about housing, for example. We can't talk about permanency, but we can talk about something in between. There's a lot of debate, a lot of linguistic gymnastics, a lot of design that's going into what is what is this kind of middle ground that's better than a tent, but that is also something that will be acceptable to different parties with different views. And so here are some different examples of some things that we're discussing. We've got some pilot projects, and pretty much all of those now in Northwest Syria at the moment. So we're talking about transitional shelter, or shelter that's appropriate for contexts of longer term protracted displacement. And then finally, I think Chris started with her reflection on the idea that we can all do something in different ways in our communities to achieve peace, that peace is not just something that we should leave to policymakers and to politicians and so on. And I think that one of the most inspiring things that I've encountered over my 40 months or so in Northwest Syria is just working with local organizations and Syrians themselves who are unceasingly and untiringly working for their own communities in the most difficult circumstances. And they're the ones I think that we need to rely on for the future, that what they hope, in even in these circumstances where there's ongoing bombardment, there's ongoing displacement, that even in these circumstances, we can make a contribution to both peace and dignity for the people who are living in Northwest Syria. So I'd like to finish there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. And if I could ask you to stop sharing your screen, Tom, and I'd like to open it up for questions. So if people would either like to put up their hand to ask a question, or put a question into the chat, that would be great. Tom, I'd probably like to bounce the ball with a question, and it goes back once again to our field visits in northern Thailand. I recall visiting the temporary shelters on the Thai-Burma border. I think at that point in time, and that was 10 years ago, those temporary shelters had been there for 30 years. There were whole generations of people that was all they knew, was those temporary shelters on the Thai-Burma border. And of course, those temporary shelters were housing the ethnic minorities who have been pushed out of Myanmar or Burma, whichever term you prefer. A question that flows for this is what is the time frame for the work that you're doing? How long will this go on? And maybe I've answered my own question by reflecting on the temporary shelters in Thailand.
I think it's the same, Charlie. I mean, it's been nearly 12 years already. I think the average stay is about 25 years. The average stay. So obviously people who are displaced for a lot longer than that. And I think that this is the challenge that humanitarian actors face, because the humanitarian parameters, humanitarian funding, humanitarian guidance is all about basic life-saving needs and responding to these basic life-saving needs. And so you do that in year 1, and you do that in year 2, and you do that maybe in year 3. But after 12 years or after 20 years, like, what are needs? It changes a lot. And I think that that's one of the points at which the system really doesn't know what to do next. And I think that's even more the case in Northwest Syria, because we're in a conflict zone. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be a renewed conflict. We don't know if the conflict is frozen. We don't know if at some stage the regime will fall and people will go back, or what the conditions of return might be. So this kind of wider political issues, frame what's possible in humanitarian terms. I mean, I think the phrase that comes back again and again to me is that the idea of the humanitarian band-aid. The humanitarian response, is only part of the solution. There needs to be a political response here, and a political solution. There's no actual humanitarian response for the needs of these people in the longer term.
Thank you, Tom. And I think David Hirsch was the next hand I saw go up. David?
Thanks. Thanks very much. Tom, as I was listening to your remarkable, instead, with the exception of what you said at the very end about local organizations, it seemed to be one disaster after another. A very sobering presentation. But I do want to ask you about the local organizations. As I understand it, what you're getting at is that you cannot sort of impose some structure of peace from the outside, from some Western view about what we think is good for you. You really need to engage with the people who actually are sharing the lived experience, and that is the local organizations. Can you just help us to understand what are the challenges that the local organizations have to contend with? Presumably they are caught up in the politics, just as in a deep and troubling way. How do they manage to do something positive for their communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question. I mean, they are caught up in a very real way. Their international organizations are often insulated a little bit from some of the local pressures. UN organizations are intergovernmental, so they're even more kind of insulated from what people think. But the local organizations are the foundation stone of the response. I mean, they're community based. They know the context. They speak the languages. They're able to, they might have political agendas, and many of them, many of the people who work for local organizations at one stage or another were involved in the revolution. They can't go back to Syria because they will be persecuted. Their safety cannot be guaranteed in regime areas. So they have a longer term political agenda, but that's also part and parcel of being a local organization. They're much more engaged in that longer term political process than I suppose international organizations are. I mean, the challenges they face, the challenges of funding, the challenges of the international system, which is based on international organizations, doesn't really support local organizations to the same degree. There are questions of capacity as well. I mean, local organizations, some are very good, some are very, very effective, others are less so. They have to respond to local demands as well. So the local connections can also be a source of weakness as pressures, local pressures, political pressures, family pressures are placed on local actors. There might be some places they can work and other places they can't. So all of these, it gets quite complex quite quickly. But I think if anything can be drawn out of it, I mean, I think Syrian organizations are generally very, very impressive. They've got a remarkable range of people who work for them. I think that eventually when the conflict does end, that there's great hope for the reconstruction of Syria, because it has the engineers and the architects and the planners and the software engineers and all the technical professions you could imagine to be able to reconstruct quickly. And these are people who have stood up for a different model. They've stood up against oppression, and they've said, all they want is their freedom. I mean, I think, so I'm rambling a bit here, but I think the thing to remember is that the Syrian revolution started in the town of Hama in 2010 with a group of children who graffitied on a wall, and they said, down with the regime, and they were tortured as a consequence of that. And so the people that we're working with have longer term peace in mind. I mean, they want to see a stable, democratic, free Syria that people can kind of express their views and not be persecuted for it. And that seems to me to be the basis of longer term hope in Syria. They've got the organization, they've got the skills, they've got the education, they know how to run a state, but there's also still, even now, I think among those NGOs, this sense of hope that a different future can be achieved.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Dave, for the question. Thank you, Tom, for that very full response. And I think Chris was the next hand up. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Tom, very briefly, if you could tell us the impact of the pandemic in the area you're working. But my main question is, assuming that Syria does have the opportunity to reconstruct itself, there will be a whole generation that won't have received education in a normally educated society How does a country, a society make up for that, please?
Yeah, look, on the pandemic, I mean, the consequences of it's ravaged Northwest Syria, as you can imagine, without a government, without a functioning health system. The vaccine rollout has been minimal. I mean, it's the responsibility now of the World Health Programme. So there is an attempt to roll the vaccine out, but still it's not been anywhere near sufficient. And just the things that would be possible in Australia, lockdowns, subsidies, continuing with people's salaries even if they're not at work, this sort of thing, it's just not possible in Syria. So in a way, the vaccines the COVID has been ignored, and people have just suffered the consequences of it. And in terms of the education question, I mean, yeah, this is it's such a disaster. I mean, so 10 years of education has been lost. We know that a vast majority of the people living in camps and the worst shelter conditions are children. There's really been a totally inadequate educational response. So that the recovery and reconstruction will fall to their educated parents. So there will be a generation that has missed out. I don't know how that's going to be rectified quickly. One of the focuses for this year for the humanitarian system, well, the two focuses, one is shelter, because the shelter conditions are so bad, and one is education, because the schools in Northwest Syria are virtually non-existent. I mean, I think maybe the hope lies with refugees and expatriate Syrians, for example, in Turkey, where there are more than 3 million Syrian refugees. The Turkish government has been extremely generous, and Syrian children have full access to the education system at all levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So maybe the future lies in terms of reconstruction with those refugee communities as well. But the situation in Northwest Syria for education is dire.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Chris, for the question. Tom, I think this next question from Deborah Hill, you talked a little bit about donor fatigue, and I think this question is linked. Deborah, thanks you for your very informative talk, and asked, well, what is it that the Australian government should be doing, or what is it more generally that developed countries should be doing to deal with the response and deal with the conflict?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think one element I think that we can all do is just make sure that it's still on the table, that people are still aware of Syria. And I think there is a problem in a sense, which is that these longer term conflicts that seem to go on and on do sort of fall off the radar. And if people stop talking about it, and if they stop, they're no longer aware of what the latest situation is, then that creates less pressure on governments to fund. And I think that one of the most effective strategies we've had for change in the humanitarian system is where people in populations in donor countries say to their governments, "Look, we need to do more." So I think just talking about it, being aware of it, raising it with politicians and so on. I mean, I think that in terms of Australia, I mean, one of the great tragedies really over the last few years is the total reduction of the aid program. So Australia went from a generous donor to being one of the least generous in the OECD. I forget what the percentage of aid to GDP is, but I think it's now about 0.25%, which is a long way from the 0.7% that was agreed by donor countries a few years ago as a standard for wealthy industrialized nations like Australia. So I think additional funding is necessary. The local NGOs here know what they're doing. The UN system is quite strong. That there's an effective response can occur. And I think that the donor nations really need to step up to that. Australia's not alone in cutting its funding. That's happened with Britain, that's happened with the US as well. But they really need to step up the funding. And I think beyond that, I mean, there's a question of political pressure as well. At some stage a resolution needs to be found, and maybe even an accommodation. But I do have the sense that there's a waning political agenda as well for a long-term peace in Northwest Syria. So I think those are some things that we can do and governments can do as well to address the situation.
Thank you, Tom. And I know we're pushing the time, but I want to take this last question because it's a beautiful question. It's a beautiful Rotary question, and I think it's linked to your last comments. And the question comes from Alex Shaw. Alex has asked the question based on the last slide you showed us that gave us a picture of what seemed to be a far more substantial shelter than a tent. So his question is, well, how much do they cost? What is it the Rotary can do? I think is what's sitting behind.
Fantastic. Yes, so I think it's a great question at the moment because I'm putting together a proposal to replace all tents in Syria. The aspiration, the stated aspiration as a response is to get rid of all tents by the end of the year, which is clearly impossible, but it's wonderful to have a really ambitious goal. So those shelters, those are from the IKEA Foundation in partnership with an organization called Better Shelter. It's similar in some respects to Shelterbox, which you might know of as a Rotary supported organization. The cost of those is about $1,500 US. Now, yeah, the costs fluctuate a bit, and we always say that they can't just be dropped on someone. They need to come with some kind of infrastructure improvement. So we estimate that to get a family out of a tent, out of these horrendous kind of short-term shelters, and into something that will last for maybe 5+ years, which will give them time, stability, peace of mind, to begin to do their own thing and begin to construct their own longer-term shelters if that's necessary, then that would cost about $2,000 in total, including the shelter itself, plus appropriate improvements to the site so they have access to sewage and drainage and electricity and water and so on.
Thank you, Tom. And that gives us something to take away and some aspirations for Rotary. So that's a nice finish to the questioning. I'd like to hand over to David Hirsch now, and David is our current chair of our peace building group within Rotary Club of Sydney. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Charlie. Tom, it's my honor to formally thank you for this very sobering presentation. When Charlie introduced you as the storyteller that you are, he was right. You have managed to really make this dreadful situation come alive for us. It's not just a matter of statistics. I think we've all been very affected by what you've shown us and what you described and by the work that you do. Charlie mentioned that in his experience with you and Sudan, I think you had mentioned something about the different vantage points of that conflict that you had. I think the vantage points are critical to understanding any conflict. After listening to what you've said and looking at those images of those tents and the children in the snow, I can only feel that my vantage point is from somewhere on the moon. I did not have any appreciation of just how dire the situation is that you've described. One of the points that I thought was particularly illuminating is this attitude about humanitarian aid being basically limited to keeping people alive. It was never the intention to have people in these temporary shelters for 25 years. I think it's remarkable that the humanitarian efforts are hamstrung by their ability to even talk about the permanence of the situation. Clearly, the only way that we're going to resolve this and restore peace to Syria, and of course to other, otherwise capable countries that have been decimated by political misfeasance, is to provide a sufficient amount of aid to them. And I think you've highlighted that Australia is not alone in reducing its aid commitment. And frankly, there is a waning interest because there's always some other catastrophe that's occupying our minds. I'm sure that I'm not the only one to be thinking that Ukraine is going to become its own humanitarian problem very, very quickly. But I think what you've left us with, which is particularly important, is that we, up on the moon, have an obligation to do something to prevail upon the governments who are supposed to be speaking for us, to prevail upon the governments to provide the kind of adequate funding that they claim is part of our ethos, and to keep this issue in the spotlight. I think it's important. That's something that we in Rotary can certainly do. I'm very grateful for you to having put the spotlight on Syria where it really deserves to be. It's been a very illuminating experience for me in this last hour, and I'm sure for other people as well. So our deepest thanks to you for opening our eyes to something that I think we were becoming a bit weary of. Congratulations for all the remarkable work that you do.
Thanks very much. No, it's great to have an opportunity to talk about it, and thanks very much for all your support and all the work that Rotary does around the world for peace and conflict resolution. I mean, it's absolutely vital work, as you can tell from this context. So thanks for having me today. It's a great pleasure and a great honor as well to be here. Thank you.